Big thank you to Dungeon Fighter Online for sponsoring today's video. Jujutsu Kaisen 0 is one of the highest grossing anime films ever released, and my first time ever hearing about it was today. In 2022, Jujutsu Kaisen was the single highest selling series in Japan,
period,
besting even One Piece, and to this day it remains one of the most popular ongoing stories in circulation with over 70 million copies sold as of writing this video. And somehow I made it to 2023 without even knowing so much as how to spell the title. Until now. So, now that I'm a spelling expert, I figured what better way to spend my weekend than by ignoring all of my friends and family and diving instead headfirst into this weird Japanese film about sorcerers fighting curse monsters and anthropomorphized panda warriors doing all sorts of crazy stuff without people seeming to bat an eye. Seriously, this dude straight up just appears on screen walking around talking as if nothing is going on, and this dude just chatting about mayonnaise or some shit. I don't know what's going on, but I digress. I'm watching this film to help me determine whether or not I'd be interested in the future with reviewing the greater series someday of Jujutsu Kaisen. So, with that out of the way, let's see if this movie was any good. Alright, I've watched the film and I have a lot to say. But in short, what did I think of it? I thought it was okay, I guess. Some parts were better than others, and I thought it had some structural issues, but I can see why some folks like it fine enough, I guess. Okay, if that felt a little lukewarm for those of you that are massive fans of the series, I think I have my reasons for feeling this way that might also justify your own feelings towards it too. For those of you that don't know, this film is an adaptation of a single volume of manga initially released in 2017, 1 year before the main series. That alone is weird, but it also means the manga of this story was actually released before the main series began and became popular after 2018. And so, naturally, because a lot of folks don't read manga, this story might have only reached you guys after having seen the series already, with you already having an appreciation for this world and its characters. And needless to say, just like all the folks who picked up this story in the spring and summer of 2017 in Japan, this was my first exposure to Jujutsu Kaisen also, which might explain my impression of the film and why they are likely a little different to you and many others. And so, given that this manga and companion film were indeed my first introduction to the Jujutsu Kaisen world, here are my honest thoughts on the story I saw. Narratively, while the story works well enough, has some likable characters and plays with some interesting narrative and visual ideas here and there, I think my main takeaway from the film is that it felt rather uninspired. However, even in my very own work server, there are those that both agree and disagree with me on this, so I'm going to do my best to explain where I'm coming from and grant concessions where I feel they're warranted. So, let's go through the film piece by piece. The introduction. The character of Yuta, and indeed the situation he finds himself trapped within, is effectively the pillar upon which this entire film is balanced. And conceptually, I think Yuta and the curse he has to live with is the single most fascinating ruffle in this story. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way either, it's a great idea. With his former childhood sweetheart having promised herself to marry him when they were older, only for her to suddenly die and now effectively haunt him in a defensive manner, it is on its face a compelling and emotionally complicated situation, one that teases some very dark and complicated themes in its opening, and one I was very excited to see explored in greater detail in this film. While the story did expand somewhat on who this girl was to Yuta and what their deal was later on, by the end, it felt as though that I knew other characters more than I did the main character in Yuta, and that's unfortunate. While he certainly has his moments, I don't think I ever felt personally connected to this character of Yuta enough for me to want to follow him on this journey. One of my biggest issues I have with the main story is that for the first half, it feels sort of aimless. The film and indeed manga very quickly establish what the goal is, of course, to remove Rika from Yuta in order to allow him to live in normal existence again, free of the horror she has brought onto his life. However, there is a problem with this, I think. Once this is established, there isn't a clear path forward for Yuta to pursue. No obvious series of events needed to be satisfied that will solve the issue at hand and meet that goal. The situation between Rika and Yuta is tragic in every sense of the word, and indeed a compelling motivation to move into a particular direction, but we aren't given much in the way of how that's going to be achieved beyond Yuta getting stronger and going to this school. Now, with that said, while I was expecting more from the introduction to this character, I was willing to wait and see what the rest of the intro had to offer. It's not like shy characters are inherently boring to me. It's only one dimension of a personality type a character like him can have, and oftentimes there are secondary aspects I can latch onto. Midoriya, or Deku from My Hero Academia, was not only a character that grew on me, but by the end of his introductory sequence had me in tears. Like Yuta, we're shown plenty of misfortune in his life, so much so that once he does eventually receive some encouragement, he collapses to the floor, clutching at his chest, crying. There's plenty of misfortune there for me to sympathize with, but the moment that connected me to the character was when he chose to be brave. Now I'm connected as well as sympathizing with this character. He's shy, but he's also tenacious, virtuous, and good. And while I can appreciate Yuta's circumstances have effectively beaten him down over many years, he still hasn't shown me enough to get invested in his story specifically beyond just being sympathetic towards it. But if I ignore all that, I can appreciate just how different a character like Yuta is for a story like this one. Shonen Jump is filled with enthusiastic good boys trying to take on the world, and in a way I did like that this was trying to do something totally different. While Deku shows strength in more obvious and easily relatable ways, Yuta is a very troubled and emotionally scarred young man who was willing to take his own life had he been given the chance to by Rika. This does remove agency from his character somewhat, but he did make a very difficult and brave decision early on in the intro portion. When confronted by Gojo, he was offered two choices: sit there alone forever, or come with him and try to do something about his situation. And while we haven't seen anything this young man has been through, we do see the toll it has taken on him, and that alone is compelling. And given that he was able to pick himself up from the depths of despair one last time to try to fix his situation, it's not difficult to see why so many people might resonate with that character. It's just, for me personally, I would have liked to have seen more from him as a character beyond that one admirable and brave choice. Thankfully, however, the rest of the cast is much more engaging and gets to demonstrate their personalities right away. Maki clearly has a chip on her shoulder, offers a lot in the way of capable fighting, and even establishes something of an emotional journey for herself in this opening sequence. Additionally, Inumaki was a surprisingly fun and engaging character, despite him not being able to speak clearly. I never would have thought that including a kid that can't speak to folks would have been a good decision, but all it does is offer him compelling alternative to speech, while also making for some really cool powers to help explain the world to us visually. And then there's Panda. He's a panda. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to talk to you about one hell of a huge game. This thing has over 850 million players worldwide and has grown to ludicrous proportions since its initial launch in Korea in 2005. It is, of course, Dungeon Fighter Online, the de facto free-to-play multiplayer hack-and-slash online multiplayer RPG. There are 16 unique characters to choose from, and those branch out into 4 or 5 advancement classes. These classes offer fascinating fighting techniques and all come with their own unique stories and concepts. This means that there are over 60 different class advancements in the game. That's a crazy amount of content and an almost guaranteed means of finding a playstyle that works for you. There's a real commitment to longevity here also, with updates and events every 2 weeks that introduce exciting new rewards and content. It's great for jumping in as new players, as these events often allow for speedy leveling up to bring you on par with current content. For example, if you jump in now for the Level Up Power Up event, you'll receive huge rewards and materials, all the best gear, and at level 100, you'll get a golden jumping capsule to instantly skip to the game's current max level of 110. It's super simple, and after that, you simply log in a few times a week for even more goodies. At the moment, there's a Neo Awakening One sale going on that offers you access to the most sought after avatar package in the game. It really is the best time to jump in, and you can do so by copying the coupon code WELCOME to DFO GIFT. You'll get a funky avatar set and some awesome bonus items to get you started. So if that sounds great, click the link in the description and download today for free. As for the world and power system, I think the idea of having curses manifest in places due to the negative experiences of the people who were once there is a great idea that ties nicely into Yuta's story with his personal curse that he's trying to get rid of. The mechanism by which they seal off areas in these domes of energy and the designs of the creatures that lurk within are all fantastic to see and enjoy. I have no issues there, and to be honest, the action concerning these encounters at this school and thereafter is terrific. Seeing and learning about the numbers game some of the weaker curses play, and of course the stomach they all end up within to save the two small children they arrived to rescue in the first place. It's all handled tremendously well, particularly in how they highlight what Yuta himself is lacking and ultimately what Rika is capable of when she's used correctly. The middle. The middle or second act of a film is largely dedicated to establishing the main conflict or antagonist, and while Rika is technically that for now, with her not providing Yuta the necessary pushback he needs to unravel this problem he's having, we need another more active protagonist to push this film in some sort of direction. And thankfully, we do eventually get that. However, before we do, once Yuta arrives in school, due to there being no clear path forward towards his established goal, all we can do as an audience is sort of just sit back, relax, and go along for the ride with Yuta and his classmates as they take on different enemies in different locations and encounter some superbly animated action sequences against curses and apparitions. The action in the film is brilliant, and you won't find any complaints from me in that department. The direction in this film is stellar, from the animation to the storyboards to the color used to light different and more dramatic scenes. And did I mention the music? There are two insert songs in this film, one at the beginning as we get ready for our first day at school with Yuta, and indeed the climax that I will get into just a little bit from now. But back on topic. I think of these opening scuffles, it's the mission Yuta shares with Inumaki that hits hardest for me, mostly because it coincides with the narrative midpoint and how it's used to actually give the story direction. But firstly, Inumaki is oddly a very endearing character, one that shares a lot and has a brilliantly effective and dicey power. I've gone on the record in saying that my favorite type of power is one that has obvious and built-in drawbacks to use it, like, okay, think Kaioken in Dragon Ball or Deku's all-for-one power in My Hero Academia. In this film, Inumaki has a very powerful ability, but it's due to its consequences that strategy needs to be employed and a palpable tension is injected into each and every encounter he participates in. I love stuff like this, and furthermore, we finally get some direction through this curse that shows up at the narrative midpoint. I did mention this moments ago, but the narrative midpoint is a very common writing technique implemented in pretty much every single story you can think of, and typically it's used to keep the story you're watching interesting. However, in this case, it has the secondary effect of finally giving the film direction. Enter Suguru Geto. This guy shows up, notices that this film doesn't have a clear story, and says, "Hey, I want to set a new world order based on my own internal bigotry. I'm a bad guy, who wants to fight me?" And everyone is like, "Yeah, okay." And just like that, we have a goal. Someone to attack in this battle shonen and actually have a means of entertainingly arriving at the climax of the story without meandering with Yuta hopping from place to place, gaining experience. Now, I want to be clear again that I can totally see why someone would connect with Yuta as a character, particularly if they themselves have gone through some troubling times in their life where they saw no way out. The strength he shows in his first meeting with Gojo is not only admirable but immeasurably brave, given how ready he was to just give up on life and everything in the first place. And in a way, I can kind of understand how a story that doesn't have a clear path to success can further feed into making that decision Yuta ultimately makes all the more brave due to the uncertain and seemingly hopeless road he's facing. Thematically, it works remarkably well and in many ways succeeds in that regard. However, it had, for me, the unfortunate added effect of making the first half of this film quite boring. Without something to latch onto or follow, it felt like we were just going from one scene to the next, going through the motions until suddenly Geto shows up and finally offers us something more to look forward to and watch develop. And I think that's important. For now, we have something of a goal to shoot for, or at the very least anticipate. We can enjoy all the positives which the character of Yuta provides with the pacing Geto offers the story. Which brings me to my final point concerning the midsection before I start to talk about the big action-filled climax. Geto is exceptionally important for the pacing of this film simply because before him, there was literally no one to drive the story forward. In storytelling, there are often two types of characters which complement each other rather well: active and reactive characters. Active characters are individuals which drive the plot forward through their actions and choices they make. Think Walter White approaching Jesse in episode 1 of Breaking Bad to kickstart his mission, or think of Eric Cartman from South Park doing something truly horrendous, forcing those around him to have to pick up the pieces. With them integrated into the scene or storyline, you can rest assured that whenever the plot lacks direction, they will leap into action to help it race towards some sort of conclusion. Alternatively, you have the reactive character type, and in the case of Yuta, you have the reactive protagonist. These are characters whose entertainment value comes not from what they project outwards onto the world, but instead how they react to that world. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, generally speaking, is a great example of such a character. As the hero, it's his duty to react to the chaos and solve the messes that the villains around him create. These types of characters can be incredibly compelling, that's for certain, and while both active and reactive protagonists can and often are in a lot of different stories, it is more often than not the reactive protagonist that requires an active force to fight against. Without Green Goblin or Dr. Octopus, Spider-Man's 1 and 2 would have sucked. And so, for the same reason that without an active force to fight or react to in the first half of this film, it felt like the story was sort of going through the motions. And once an active character did arrive, suddenly it felt like a film again, or at least that's how I saw it. And from here on, in all honesty, I had a lot of fun with this film, and so let's break down the climax, which I thoroughly enjoyed. The end. Just like choosing Yuta as the main character was an interesting decision, this film also makes an equally interesting and oddly compelling choice in making the antagonistic forces weaker than the forces of good. I've mentioned before that I'm a fan of what Geto offers the story, but I really mean it when I say that the strategy he's forced to employ makes him feel all the more devious and clever. With him being forced to navigate and strategize around his fewer forces in a successful manner, it acts not just as the perfect setup for some fights, but very quickly brings him in contact with Yuta, which is exactly what I wanted. I love the way with which Geto manages to corner Yuta and everyone back at base. I love that the shroud he encapsulates the area with prevents communication to the outside, and I love the role all of the supporting cast played in defending Yuta from this monster. Seriously, Panda and Inumaki's team up was something to behold in the anime and really elevated the material that already existed in the manga. They didn't have that much of a fight in the manga, but in the anime it's fantastic and very quickly became my favorite action moment of the film. But it's the final fight between Yuta and Geto that becomes the fight to end all fights within this film, and the surprise it ends on not only offers a solution to the conflict of the film, but indeed facilitates the answers that remedy Yuta's current circumstances, making this final third of the film comfortably the best part and most cohesive part of the narrative, in my book at least. The team up of Yuta and Rika is nothing but cathartic and frantically fun to watch as the young troubled boy comes to grips more and more with his powers and in the process becomes more and more aware of what he's capable of. And in truth, he sort of has all of these powers through Rika, but it's in that overpoweredness that grants Geto his appeal for finding the golden path forward, and indeed Yuta in learning to deal with what he is and accepting the help of Rika. Working together to take down this formidable and intimidating foe, both of these characters bringing out the best in each other. With the climax of the fighting seeing Yuta effectively choosing to offer himself up to Rika in order to save everyone else. It's a scary but compelling contrast made to the very first scene where, in a desperate attempt to protect everyone from himself, he tried and failed to take his own life. Now, while offering up his life once again, it's through embracing what he once was so terrified of, proving that even the most terrifying and unsightly parts of ourselves can yield positive outcomes for everyone, and that we, if we have the strength and resolve to do so, can move forward and make a difference in this world if we choose to fight. Once again, Yuta as a character and the delivery of this idea is, like I said at the beginning, the most impressive narrative choice made in this film, and how it's demonstrated is just as fascinating. With the climax of the fight coming to an end and the monster that he once feared now having melted away, thematically he's proven that he can live a normal life, and Rika will wait for him. And the twist that made all of this possible was that he was the one that put the curse on Rika, and that was a fantastic cherry on the top of this brilliantly orchestrated narrative cake. And now that he's set her free, he too has freed himself from the prison of his own guilt and inability to move on. And while I can appreciate all of that, I do still find myself wishing that if this film had fleshed out all of his character a bit more towards the beginning of the film, that I might not have found the first half as boring as I did. Interestingly, or perhaps tellingly, there's a page towards the end of this manga where the author of Jujutsu Kaisen, Gege Akutami, wrote about his process when it came to writing stories. In it, he said, "When I start a manga series, I don't really have a theme or principles in mind. I begin by thinking about things like, these twists would be interesting, or these characters might be cool, or this scene would be amazing." Now, I don't want to jump to conclusions, and I think it's fair to point out that the mainline series probably doesn't suffer from the same problems I thought this film did. But with a character like Yuta and the horrific scene and circumstances he's introduced with, it seems like this was a character and scene that Akutami wanted and thought would be cool to write about, but didn't consider how he would later have that character navigate the story in a meaningful way to the next relevant plot beats. Later at the end of that manga, when talking about the mainline Jujutsu Kaisen series, he goes on to talk about how he has ideas for scenes and endings, but just doesn't know how to connect the various ideas he has in his head just yet. And while I think that's a fine approach for a more well-versed writer that he could very well be right now, I think it was perhaps that approach which made this first half of the film as boring and as aimless as it seemed to me. With that said, however, this film had tons to appreciate, and I'd be lying if I said that going back over my notes and analyzing this film more and more hasn't already given me a greater appreciation for it. So while I stand by all of my criticisms I've given it thus far, and think that the film is plagued with creative decisions that in large sections made it a bore to watch, and as I said at the beginning, a little too reliant on tropes resulting in a rather uninspired path towards a finish line that I did very much like, and despite me personally not seeing it as anything more than a 6 out of 10, I can absolutely see why someone might give this film an 8 or a 9 if they connected to it in the right way. And who knows, maybe if I watch the series and revisit this film sometime down the line, I might have a different reaction too. But the question remains, has this story given me enough to capture my interest? Has it enticed me to want to pick up and review the first season of the Jujutsu Kaisen anime? Well, I don't know yet. Let me know what you think down below, and while you do, I'll be considering it. But until then, I hope you will subscribe for more honest and in-depth reviews like this, and if you're feeling so generous, you can support me over on patreon.com/totallynotmark. Take care everyone, and thank you all so much for watching.